Alright, let's get scholarly. James Maris here, and today we're going to be talking about music throughout human history. It's a pretty dense topic, but it's necessary in order to understand and write music. Plus, you know what they say, you don't know where you're going until you know where you've been. Man, I feel like I need some props or something for this one. One sec. Cool, that's better. Let's get started. So, going back to before the very beginning of music history, you'll find that we've been making music and playing instruments for at least the last 40,000 years. As far as we currently know, flutes were the first prehistoric instruments, and about 10 years ago, some flutes were discovered made out of mammoth ivory and different types of bones inside of some German caves. That's pretty cool, right? Picturing our earliest ancestors sitting around the fire, playing flutes and using their voices to mimic the natural sounds around them. Following the prehistoric era and the advent of the written language, humans started writing actual songs. In the ancient city of Ugarit in present-day Syria, one of the oldest known songs was discovered, written on clay tablets in a type of cuneiform. These songs were written for voice and a type of harp over 3,400 years ago by the Hurrian people.
The Hurrian people? What's the rush?
It's around this time that cultures all over the world start to find their own sound, and new instruments like bagpipes, drums, and stringed instruments started turning up in places like Iran and India, to name a few. Even reeded instruments like the Greek aulos started turning up around 400 BCE. Fast forward a few hundred years to the fall of the Roman Empire and the spread of the Roman Catholic Church, and you start to see formal Western music taking shape. Religious chants were unified under the Gregorian style, and even though it took a couple hundred years to get it down, this was when humans really began to invent and optimize music notation as we know it today. This period is known as the medieval era, and during this time, music got more complex as composers experimented with writing multiple, independent melodic lines, also known as polyphony. Following the medieval era, we enter music's Renaissance period, lasting from around 1400 to 1600 AD, and it was France, Belgium, and the Netherlands who were primarily responsible for kicking things off. The polyphonic chants evolved into melodic lines supported by blended, balanced harmonies, and thanks to the invention of the printing press in 1439, sharing music across cultures and styles had never been easier nor cheaper. During the Renaissance period, instruments like the violin and guitar started to evolve, and new woodwind and brass instruments like the bassoon and trombone start to show up. After the Renaissance, we enter the Baroque period, and this is where we start to meet some of our more well-known rock star level composers like Bach, Vivaldi, and Handel. Most people would say this period lasted about 150 years, ending around 1750, and we have this era to thank for the introduction of the concerto and the opera. Secular music began to flourish during this time, and composers became more and more interested in evoking and portraying emotions in their music while experimenting with new song structures. Next, we have the classical era, where composers... Whoa, what are you talking about, classical music? Bach, Vivaldi, you've been talking about classical music this whole dang time. Yes. While some people might group composers like Bach, Mozart, Debussy, or even Copland into the category of classical music, technically, classical music refers to a specific period of time from around 1750 to the early 1800s. Oh. So that means when discussing classical music, sometimes it's important to make that distinction. Are you talking about specific composers from the classical era, like Haydn, Mozart, and a good chunk of Beethoven? Or do you consider basically everything before Elvis classical music? Some distinctions of music from the classical era include a move away from the harpsichord and towards the piano, generally lighter and clearer textures overall, as well as the introduction of the sonata form. In the Romantic era, which lasted roughly between the late 1700s and the early 1900s, music became even more expressive and descriptive. You might recognize Beethoven, Chopin, and Schumann as early Romantic era composers, and Brahms, Liszt, and Mahler as later Romantic era composers. Musical work started getting longer and longer, and composers and consumers alike really start to invest more national pride. In the late 1800s and spilling into the 20th century, we had the Impressionist period, which has some of my favorite music. Debussy and Ravel led the way, composing pieces that skirted atonality and rejected conventional meters, while experimenting with instruments' individual tone colors and techniques. Instead of focusing on storytelling and emotions like in the Romantic era, Impressionists aimed to suggest rather than describe, narrating the story from afar as a third person. They also used unusual chord combinations with dreamy dissonance.
Alright, so we scratched the surface of what led to the musical styles we know and love today, and I think that's a good place to wrap up for now. Keep a lookout for part 2 of this video where I dive into the history of modern music. Thanks, and keep watching.